Hey there, it's Silver, and this is Oaken. Oaken is a turn-based, hex-based roguelite that's going for more of a faster-paced idea than a lot of its contemporaries. Normally, obviously, a turn-based strategy is relatively slow-paced, because that's just the nature of the game type that they're going with, but in this case, the pacing is a lot faster than usual, simply because of, well, actually two major factors. For one, the boards that you're actually playing on are very compact. They're super small, to the point where the whole thing fits on one screen without any sort of zooming necessary. And the other thing is that units don't have a tremendous amount of health in this game, and positioning and rotation is extremely important, and that means that even the tankier units in the game can actually be killed relatively quickly, which means battles don't tend to last very long. So every individual battle is actually sort of a bite-sized experience, which means that your average run in this doesn't actually last that long, and is a relatively accessible experience while still being tactically challenging. So the main way that it works is you have a hero unit, and this hero unit is your main actual unit that represents you, and if they die, then you lose. This unit will also have a couple of spells that they can have access to every turn. They can only cast them once per turn, though. And then you'll also choose a guide, and a guide is basically like a spirit that actually fights alongside you. They are multiple things at once. They, for one, will give you some other spells, depending on the guide you choose. They also have a unique artifact that comes along with them that will give your whole army some sort of passive as long as you choose that particular guide, and they're also an actual unit that you can summon. Although, unlike the other units that you summon in this game and spells, which take the form of cards in a hand, the guide card is in its own spot and is always available to use. You don't have to draw them, although they do tend to cost quite a bit, so you generally can't use them right from the start of battle. And once you're ready to go, you'll be plopped down on a very Slay the Spire sort of node-based grid of stuff to do. There are several different nodes that you can come across. There are easy battles that can give you access to some dust or orbs, which we'll get onto in a little bit. There's also medium battles, which will give you access to new cards to choose from, as well as elite battles, which are of course much harder but give you new artifacts to choose from. There's the boss battle at the end, and a couple of other incidental types of nodes in between that you can find. And once you get into your first battle, you're off, and the way that it works is you have this relatively compact hex-based grid to maneuver on, and your hero will always be on the grid right at the start. You don't summon them or anything, they're just there by default, and then you'll have some enemies or some other threats to face. You have a hand of 4 cards, it's always exactly 4 cards, and you have an energy gauge that will start at 3. And the way that the energy works in this game is you just spend it like normal, and it does not carry over to the next turn, but at the beginning of each turn it is refilled back to full and plus 1 extra. So on your second turn you'll have 4 energy, and it goes all the way up to 7 energy total. And you simply use this energy to play different cards from your deck, and these cards represent both spells that have both offensive and defensive and supportive as well uses, and of course actual units to summon that you can plop onto the board and move around. And movement in this game is extremely important. Positioning is everything, and it is usually the determining factor between a win and a loss. And rotation is also really important, because the way that it works is most units can only move 1 hex per turn, so you can't just send them all the way across the board. And you also have a rotation. Every hex has 6 different points of rotation that you can choose to face, one at each of the points of the hex. And you'll notice at the foot of each of the units there's this sort of green arc, or a red one for the enemies. And this is a sort of line of sight indicator where basically whenever 2 units attack each other, they both do damage to each other at the same time, which means even if you kill one unit, it still hits your unit for damage at the same time, sort of like Magic the Gathering style. But you can only attack units that you're facing, that are actually within the facing of that green arc, and which means you have to rotate to actually face an enemy unit before you can attack them, even if they're adjacent to you. This also means that if you attack an enemy from behind, or from where there's a gap in this arc, then they won't counterattack and you'll basically get free damage, which is obviously something that you want to try and do as often as possible, because like I mentioned earlier, units in this game die pretty fast. They don't have a lot of health, so being able to deal damage without taking damage in return is actually one of the most valuable things you can do on your turn. There's also some other elements on the board aside from units. There are sometimes these sort of runes that are carved into the surface, and these give you some sort of boost if you are occupying that particular hex. These are often very powerful to take control of, but of course if you want to keep a hold of them, you've got to keep a unit on them stationary and just sort of try and rotate them to be as effective as possible, which isn't always easy to do depending on what kind of enemies you're facing. There can also be hazards like spikes and clouds of horrible stuff, as well as stuff falling from the ceiling, and there's even a system of different colored tiles. You'll see that some of the tiles are sort of purple and some of them are green. And these actually can give bonuses and detriments to different units. And not all units are affected by the color of the tile that they're on, but there are some that will have some extra stats based on what they're actually standing on. And in fact, one of your spells that you always have access to will turn a tile green, and this can be really useful because there are some units that actually get both an attack and a health bonus if they're on a green tile, and there are also some that can be summoned on a green tile even if you're not very close to it, so you can actually summon something all the way across the board if there happens to be a tile that you own over there. So yeah, it's always useful to turn them to your side if you can, even if you don't get an immediate benefit from it, because there are a good number of units that have some sort of synergy with that and make them stronger in some way. Another one of the interesting things the game does is the shrine mechanic. Sometimes there'll be these glowy shrines on the sides of the map, and if you do something, just hovering over the shrine with your mouse will tell you, it will actually permanently upgrade a unit for that whole run, not just for that battle. So these can be really valuable if you can meet their requirements, but some of their requirements are very specific. Sometimes it's as simple as just summoning a unit adjacent to the shrine will upgrade it. Sometimes it's a little bit less advantageous, like plopping a unit next to it will turn that unit immobile for the rest of the battle, but will still permanently upgrade it. And other times a unit actually has to be killed next to the shrine in order for it to be upgraded. So it depends on the one that you run into, but they're often worth looking into because, you know, a permanent unit upgrade for basically free is a really valuable thing to find. But one of the biggest differences between this game and a lot of other deck builders of the style is how it handles your cards. Because normally in one of these games, when you play a card, it goes to the discard pile, and then once all of your cards are in the discard pile, you shuffle it back into your draw pile and start over. But it doesn't quite work that way in this game. Whenever you play a card for the first time, whether it's a unit or a spell, that card will become unstable, which means when you draw it again, it'll be sort of all purple and wibbly. And just to show you that it's unstable, it'll cost the same and do the same thing, but there's obviously something wrong with it. And if you use it again while it's unstable, it'll still have its effect, but it will completely exhaust the card and you won't be able to play it again. And this doesn't just last for that battle, by the way. You can actually exhaust your cards over multiple battles, and you won't be able to use them for a while until you're able to heal them back up. This is a pretty big deal because it means you can't just throw infinite units at a problem until it goes away. You will simply run yourself out of resources, you'll exhaust all your cards, and you will have nothing left to use. So you have to be really smart about how you use your resources in this game and use your units effectively enough to where you're actually keeping them alive long enough to constantly, you know, be able to win trades and stuff like that. Because obviously if your cards keep dying, you're going to have to keep summoning more, and eventually you're going to run out of new units to summon, and you're going to start exhausting already summoned cards, and then you're in a really bad spot. Also, somewhat unusually for this genre, your health is actually restored back to full after each battle. You don't have a persistent health total that lasts between battles, but instead there's a different mechanic, and that's the fatigue mechanic. Sometimes you'll come across enemies that have this thing called voiceless or other effects like that, and they do fatigue damage when they hit your units, which means it actually reduces their maximum health. And this is permanent. It's not something that only lasts until the end of the battle. So when you leave the battles, some of your units will have less health than normal. And by the way, fatigue does not stop at 1. You can actually fatigue a unit all the way down to 0 health and be completely unable to summon it. So you've got to be very careful about fighting those units and trading with them so that you don't get all your units smacked down to really low maximum health totals to where they just can't do anything anymore. And you can heal fatigue in multiple different ways, but it's costly to do so. Winning battles will give you this resource called Lumi Dust, and this is sort of like gold. It's a resource that you use for a lot of stuff. And one of the things you can use this dust for is by spending 4 of it to cure 1 stack of fatigue on any unit, which means it's very expensive, because if you have like 3 or 4 units, each with 1 or 2 stacks, then you're going to need a lot of dust to heal all of that, but it is an effective way to specifically target an individual and get them back up to full health. You can also sometimes find resting nodes, the kind of common like camp nodes that games like this tend to have, and one of the options on those resting nodes is to rest to heal 4 stacks of fatigue on everything, which is very valuable. But also, when you finish a chapter, when you beat the final boss of that chapter and move on to the next one, all fatigue of all units are healed. There's also a pretty robust unit upgrade mechanic because there's multiple different ways to do it. For one, you can spend 12 dust to upgrade a unit, which will usually give it either 1 extra attack or 1 extra health. Every time you do it, it'll tell you exactly which stat it's going to upgrade. And units tend to have anywhere from 2 to 4 upgrade slots, so they can be upgraded multiple times, improving them incrementally each time. You can also find these things called wisps, which are sort of like equipment. Every wisp will give a bonus to health and or attack, it'll show you on the wisp, and they also have some sort of passive benefit that they give the unit, and every unit can be equipped with 1 wisp. So there's all sorts of them, and they even have multiple rarities, of course improving their effects each time, from more basic stuff like just giving it 1 extra attack and not much else, to giving it the ability to shield itself from damage a little bit, or the ability to move twice per turn, which can be pretty huge, or even more legendary rarity ones that can turn your units into ranged units and actually allow them to attack at range. There's also, of course, a lot of variety in the cards that you can find. You can find all sorts of spells, from various spells that are just purely offensive, like they just deal damage, to more advanced stuff like spells that actually improve units in a specific arc in front of you and allow you to move them forward remotely, and so you can get them to move multiple times in a turn and stuff like that. There's actually quite a lot of strategy in using the spells correctly, and as far as the units themselves go, there's a lot of different units in this game that all have, of course, their own health and damage totals, as well as all sorts of other passive effects, like getting +1/+1 whenever they're on a green tile, to actually allowing themselves to refresh their attack once per turn if they kill an enemy with their basic attack, and some other things like that. So you can find a lot of variety when it comes to the troop types that you can recruit. Another thing I really like is the spell upgrade system. So spells can be upgraded apart from units, but they work a little bit differently. Instead, you need something called a Lumi Globe for them, which is generally obtained instead of dust as a choice. So you gotta kind of choose between one or the other on certain battle screens. But when you get one of these, you can plop it onto a spell and you'll get 3 different upgraded versions of that spell to choose from. So it doesn't just increment the spell's damage or anything like that, it actually gives you a whole list of 3 different plus upgrades that will change the way the spell works. Like instead of just doing some damage, maybe now it'll do some vampiric damage and actually heal you, or maybe it'll also ensnare them as it does damage, stuff like that. This is a really cool idea because it means every spell is actually like 4 different spells, because you can upgrade it into a branch of 3 different ways depending on what sort of build you're going for and what else your army is composed of at the time. This is actually one of those games as well, by the way, where you can't really judge it from the first run alone, because when I first did my initial run through of the game, I actually beat it my very first try. I went all the way to the end and beat the final boss and everything without any unlocks or any prior knowledge of the game, so it wasn't that challenging. However, after that first run is done, it becomes a lot more difficult because you unlock a lot of extra stuff that really diversifies the challenge of the game. So you get stuff like a talent tree that allows you to upgrade yourself in various ways, like, for instance, the ability to use dust to upgrade your guide unit, which is pretty huge. But you also get stuff like stacking difficulty modifiers that you can activate to give yourself some extra challenge as well as extra reward, and there are 3 different tiers of these things that you can actually unlock and go through as you continue to beat the game, with more and more difficult varieties of them active at once. There's also multiple different branching paths that you can find after your first playthrough, where you can go to much more difficult branches of the dungeon that will have more hazardous and difficult boards to actually manage, because they have a lot more traps and stuff on them that just make them more challenging, as well as other passive effects that make them a lot harder to complete. And of course, those areas tend to have much more difficult bosses as well. And of course, after that initial run, you'll be unlocking various other mechanics like new cards and spells, new guides to choose from with new artifacts, and of course some other new mechanics to run into to surprise you, like the aforementioned shrines, which don't actually appear at first. So yeah, there's actually quite a bit to this game, and don't let the first run of it fool you. It's not quite that straightforward on your second run and beyond, because there is a lot more moving parts, there's a lot more stuff to do after that initial more linear run through, which I find kind of an interesting way to do things. Also, the game is relatively narrative heavy, which is unusual for a deck builder like this. There's actually a pretty good story thread running through the whole thing that's actually kind of fun to follow, and seems to link into what's going to be the second hero later on once they implement that into the game, in terms of having multiple different factions and how they're sort of warring in this world around this big magical oak tree. So yeah, my view of Oaken is that it's actually really fun. It's a super solid turn-based strategy roguelite that has a lot going on with it, a good amount of variety, and of course a beautiful art style. The music is also really nice. Just in general, the presentation of this game is top-notch, really nice looking, very pleasant to play in terms of like its UI and stuff like that is all very slick and responsive, and it's just a pretty good time in general. So I would recommend it personally if you're a fan of roguelites or turn-based strategies or just like tactical combat in general. So there you go. I will of course link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Oaken. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.